Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Bow, 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 bow.
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for Agenda here at Freedom Now.
Habarigani. This is Sister Thade with Freedom Now's agenda for this Black History Saturday, February 21st, 2026. We want to remind everyone that it's closing weekend happening now at the 34th Pan-African Film Festival here in Los Angeles. So today and tomorrow there are films, panels, and awards. For more information, the website is www.paff.org. And this hour, our agenda, Sister Luyanda Kuboka presents our African Drumbeat Historical Calendar. Then, prolific author, radical historian, Professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne interviews Kimberly Lau, Professor of Literature at UC Santa Cruz and author of the book Specters of the Marvelous, Race and the Development of the European Fairy Tale. And later in the hour, Dr. Horne interviews Jason Borge, Professor of Latin American and Cultural Studies at the University of Texas at Austin, about his book Jazz Odyssey, The Global Lives of Booker T. Pittman. And we dedicate today's program with tribute to the Reverend Jesse Jackson with the clip from Cannonball Adderley with the track Walk Tall after our agenda. We are in Fund Drive, and so please support Freedom Now this hour by donating and receiving one of our Black History Month thank you gifts, as we still bring you 2 full interviews this hour. So please call or go online to contribute. 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. Or you can go to kpfk.org and make your pledge this hour to support Freedom Now. Brother Gary Baca, who's our KPFK program director and global village host, will be helping us fundraise during this Freedom Now Hour of Power. Our music clip mix includes MLK, Zap Mama, Alice Coltrane, Cannonball Adderley featuring Jesse Jackson, Donald Byrd, George Robert, Eddie Henderson, Gilbert Castellanos, Curtis Fuller, and more. So sit back, phone a friend, and as always, we stand ready for revolution.
That is that the storm really doesn't matter until the storm begins to get you down.
This is KPFK 90.7 FM Los Angeles. I'm Gary Baca here for Freedom Now, asking you to go to your phone. We are significantly behind in our station's goal, and we're asking you to pledge for Freedom Now with Dr. Gerald Horne, a historian, scholar, talks about the history and discrimination that has plagued America. This can be heard every Saturday from 11 to 12 p.m. When we talk about the meaning of Freedom Now, it represents an urgent, contemporary demand for the immediate reclamation of inalienable human rights, focusing on overcoming systemic oppression, displacement, and the fight for peace. Freedom Now, what does that mean today? The active defense of rights. It's a call to protect individuals from government repression. Freedom Now, featuring advocacy for those wrongly imprisoned and ensuring human rights are upheld in volatile regions. Freedom from fear. It encompasses freedom from economic insecurity, violence, and the fear of being targeted, allowing people to live without constant anxiety. Freedom is a big word and has a huge meaning. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. That's the number to call to pledge your support. Hit option 2 and that goes to the phone room. And in this way, we keep Freedom Now on the air and we keep free speech alive. Cultural and global action. Freedom Now, it is increasingly expressed through global cross-cultural collaboration to assert that freedom is a universal right, not restricted by nationality or background. Freedom Now, the modern understanding, highlights the need to balance personal liberties, challenging the rise of authoritarian control. Freedom Now is a proactive, often urgent demand for immediate justice, safety, in the face of ongoing real-world threats. 818-985-5735. Keep freedom alive. Keep freedom now. 818-985-5735 in the great work that Gerald Horne has been doing researching the history of racism and discrimination. Who does this but KPFK? I'm Gary Baca and I'm asking you to go to your phone and please pledge your support. That $25, that $50 goes a long way for racism and discrimination. It exposes the truth. And you hear it here on KPFK. We are not supported by corporate entities, colleges, universities, the federal government. We are Freedom Now and we are free speech to do what we need to do for the public of Los Angeles and Southern California. So if you want truth to power, if you need the truth, then keep us on the air so that we remain vigilant and resistant. 818-985-5735. Call now. 818-985-5735. Call now for Freedom Now. Stole the land from the Native Americans and then built homes on slave labor. Does that sound right? Well, hey, it was hundreds of years ago, and let's forget that. Let's forget about reparations. Let's forget about taking care of the Native American people and living close to them, living with them, and learning about the earth, Mother Earth, planting, taking care of it, but instead drilling, contaminating the oceans. So once again, folks, Freedom Now is a show that runs here every Saturday from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. And it's really important that we get you to the phones right now. Freedom Now, the power or right to speak, act, and change as one wants without hindrance or restraint. Freedom is a right. Freedom to say what you believe in. 818-985-5735.
Molweni Ekhaya. This is Sister Luyanda with the African Drum Beat Historical Calendar for the week of February 22nd. February 22nd, 1832. First African Women's Anti-Slavery Society established in the United States. A A number and a variety of such women's anti-slavery groups are documented in the abolitionist press of these times, establishing the connection between the suffrage and freedom movements. Free African women were active in these societies, many of which were actually racially mixed. February 23, 1868, W.E.B. Du Bois, scholar and Pan-Africanist, is born. February 24th, CIA-inspired military coup deposes President Nkrumah, leader of the Pan-African movement, and established neo-colonial rule in Ghana, 1966. February 25th, 1936, Russian-American Rose Pesotta arrived as an organizer for the Goodyear Rubber Workers sit-in, the first in the U.S., lifelong anarcho-syndicalist, a waste maker in the garment industry, and then a union organizer for the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, and later the Congress of Industrial Organizations. February 25th, settler colonialism intensified in colonial U.S. as law is passed giving rewards for Indian scalps, 1745. February 26, 1938 to June 8, 1938. The National Dollar Store chain owned the largest garment factory in San Francisco, Chinatown. When its owner, Zhong Shung, tried to implement part-time shifts, the 200 mostly Chinese American women workers protested, demanding a 9-hour full-time workday and a union representation. They went on strike for 14 weeks with support of the ILGW and Chinese American leftist organizations. The workers won their demands after a bitterly fought battle both in and out of courts. February 26, 1978, Mangaliso Sobukwe, founder of the Pan-African Congress of Azania, dies. February 27, 1890 to November 29, 1989, Barbados-born African healthcare activist, devoted her life to battling racial discrimination in the education and employment of African nurses. She helped to establish Harlem's first inpatient facility for African patients with tuberculosis and one of the few city hospitals where African physicians were permitted to treat their patients. February 27, Oglala Sioux Nation fought U.S. government over occupation at Wounded Knee in 1973.
For KPFK Radio, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Kimberly Lau, Professor of Literature at the University of California at Santa Cruz, and author of the book Specters of the Marvelous, Race and the Development of the European Fairy Tale. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Kimberly Lau.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So why did you produce this book?
Well, I've been a scholar of the fairy tale for probably 10 to 15 years, maybe longer, maybe 20 years. And I started to notice that there were stories that I thought were metaphorically alluding to race. And I had never read anything in the literature about race in relation to the European fairy tale. So that was really my starting point. And I started digging. And what I found was pretty astounding to me, to the point where I ended up making an argument in this book that racial thinking is actually formative for the very genre of the European fairy tale itself.
Now, the fairy tale genre, as I understand it, implicates racial thinking for 2 centuries. How so? And what about before this period? Let's say stretching back to medieval times. Was,
I,
was
I I'm not as familiar with the fairy tale in medieval times. I begin my story. I begin this book with a collection from the early 17th century by Jean-Baptiste Basile called The Tale of Tales. And this is widely considered the first collection of fairy tales, the first European collection of fairy tales. There were, of course, fairy tales in oral tradition, and other authors had published or written fairy tales before this time, but this is really the first collection of fairy tales. So I begin there, and that collection is a frame. It has a frame narrative, so it describes an event of 5 days, 10 stories told each day, and the framing narrative that holds it all together, that brings it together, is about a Black slave girl who usurps the position of the rightful bride, this white princess. And then the tales contained within this collection have very specific references for the time period to Blacks, slaves, Moors, and they're treated very badly. And so that really stimulated my interest as well as the study. And then the collections that I look at after that all kind of build on those tales by Basile.
so is it fair to infer that these fairy tales that you look at, in part, they're seeking to rationalize or justify colonialism and slavery, for example?
I don't know how conscious of a rationalizing project that was. I would certainly say that they are complicit in the perpetuation of imperialism, colonialism, racism, systems of slavery. In the last collection or series that I consider, which is Andrew Lang's Colored Fairy Book series, which was published in beginning in 1889 and running through 1910. There, I would say there is a more intentional project of bolstering British Empire. So there we really do see a complicity with social evolutionary theory, which we know is very racist, with British colonialism and British imperialism. But in the earlier collections, I don't know that it's necessarily an intentional project of complicity.
hmm And what about Beauty and the Beast? First of all, tell us about this story. And second of all, tell us how it fits into your narrative.
Great, of course. Beauty and the Beast is probably one of the most well-known European fairy tales. It often circulates around a young girl of modest means who ends up with in the most familiar version that we know, ends up with a beast character in his castle. It's kind of a palace. She's treated wonderfully, but he's a beast figure, and every night he asks her if she will marry him, and she's really disturbed by this idea, and she says no. And eventually she leaves the castle, and but while she's away from him, she realizes that she has feelings for him, so she returns to the castle, often after having broken a promise to return. So she often promises to return within a certain time period and doesn't do that, but then returns eventually and finds him dying and declares her love for him. And at that point, he's transformed into a human, and then they're married. So this story is also related to Cupid and Psyche, in which Cupid comes to visit Psyche at night, and he tells her he becomes her nocturnal lover, but she has never seen him. And he says, whatever you do, don't ever look upon me. And her sisters, who are jealous, encourage her to break that prohibition. And so she lights a candle, and the candle wax drops on his face and wakes him. And then he leaves, and Aphrodite, his mother, sets all these tasks for her to do in order to win him back, which she eventually does. And I mentioned the Cupid and Psyche because in that first collection of fairy tales that I mentioned, The Tale of Tales by Jean-Baptiste Basile, there are two versions of Cupid and Psyche / Beauty and the Beast. They kind of pivot between the two, and they're basically the same story, in which a young poor girl is comes across what's explicitly called a handsome black slave, who invites her to his palace, usually underground. And so she goes to live with him, and she's treated very well. And at night, they have sexual relations. And one night she decides to look at him. So she turns on the light, and she finds that at night he's disenchanted and he becomes white. And this is all explicit in the tale. The language is something like, she was shocked to find that ebony became ivory, things like that. And he has told her not to look at him, and so she's cast out. She has to go through all these trials to win him back. And so, which she eventually does, and they're married. I look at this tale, these two tales, in this first collection of European fairy tales, in which the character that we come to know later as the Beast character is an explicitly named handsome black slave. So we see there a connection in the fairy tale history between the black slave and the eventual Beast character. And we know, of course, in Western culture, the very frequent association between black men and beasts. Later, if we fast forward to the 18th century, the middle of the 18th century, we have two French versions of this story, the two that we're probably most familiar with today. They're literary versions. The first one was published by Madame Villeneuve in 1740, and that one has a frame tale as well, and it involves a plantation owner in Saint-Domingue, which we know today as Haiti, and he sends his daughter back to Paris to be educated. And while she's being educated, she becomes betrothed. And so she's traveling back to the island on a ship with her chaperone. And she asks the chaperone to tell her stories to pass the time. And that gives way to Villeneuve's version of Beauty and the Beast. So we see already there's a very colonial setting for this tale, and a colonial setting that depends on African labor, right? Is a plantation owner. Later, about 15 years later, in 1756, Madame Beaumont wrote the version that we know best today, which is in a magazine for young girls, also has a frame tale. And there, after each story is told, the governess in the frame tale sort of asks the pupils different questions. And she asks one of the girls, Miss Molly, how would you react to being in this situation where you're living with a beast? And she says something along the lines of, I would at first probably be frightened, but then I think I would become used to it, just as I was frightened by my father's black boy, who I eventually became used to. So we can see over the course of Beauty and the Beast, these different variations over time, a very clear relationship between the beast, what we come to know as the beast figure, and black men. And so I think this is a really critical fairy tale for understanding the broader argument that I'm making in this book.
Now, there was a recent version of Beauty and the Beast, if I'm not mistaken. How does it distinguish itself from these previous versions?
A recent version being there in the 1940s, I think Jean Cocteau did a film version. Mm-hmm. And then we have Disney's film versions, and we have a lot of television and other kinds of versions. In those versions, I think the racialization of the Beast character really falls away. And we just see simply a sort of animalistic man. And we know that he's enchanted often because he treated someone badly by judging them by what was on the surface. So I think the argument that I make is that all the racial thinking that led to the initial kind of beast characters in Basile is metaphorized as the beast becomes, simply an animalistic man. But we know that sort of long legacy of association between the two.
Now, what about The Little Mermaid and the controversy about casting? How does that fit into your story?
Yeah, that's in Disney, in relation to Disney's live action film version of The Little Mermaid. I should start by saying The Little Mermaid is a fairy tale that doesn't really exist in oral tradition. It was written by Hans Christian Andersen, and Disney's first version of The Little Mermaid, the animated version, changes it already from there, gives it a happy ending, and then the live action version, which you're asking about, was very controversial because it cast Halle Bailey as the Little Mermaid. She's a Black actress and singer. And there was a lot of discourse in social media and a lot of pushback saying, this is not my Ariel. Ariel is the name of the Little Mermaid in Disney's animated version. This is not my Ariel. Disney's just trying to be woke. This is not the original. And we actually don't know in the original that the Little Mermaid was white, right? That's an assumption. I think that speaks to how deeply white the European fairy tale world is. That assumption's reinforced by illustrations. But there's no language in The Little Mermaid that says that she's white. And I think this language of authenticity and originality, staying true to the quote unquote real fairy tale, is really dangerous and disingenuous. We don't know from the language of the stories themselves that they're white protagonists.
Now, as I understand it, explicit racialization becomes more hidden and metaphorical over time. Might that be because of the rise of a strong and strident anti-racism movement?
That's a great question. I don't know. My inclination is no, but because what I do in the book is I try to read the fairy tales, these different collections of fairy tales that emerge over time in different periods and in different European countries in relation to what was happening politically and socially, culturally at the time. So in France, which is at the end of the 17th century, that collection that I look at, there was, I wouldn't say an anti-racist movement, but there was an upholding of natives, indigenous people of the Americas, the New World to the French, right, as these noble savages. So even as they were looked down upon in many ways, and certainly according to French standards in need of civilizing practices, they were also upheld for what were perceived to be some of their noble ways of living. And so the metaphorization that I see happening there in the move from the beast to other the handsome black slave as the beast to other kinds of animal grooms is really a kind of metaphorization of the colonized peoples of the time. And then later in the Grimm's collection, which is the next collection that I look at, we do have, that's 1812, that's set against the backdrop of conversations around abolition and also Jewish emancipation. But there I would say the Grimm's tales, perhaps we could say that they had a certain awareness of racism because of those conversations happening in the background. But I would say that there are several tales that are explicitly anti-Semitic, and that I argue the Grimms themselves, were anti-Semitic as well. which I believe we can see in the way that they edited the tales.
And what about Disney, the major corporation, headquarters in Burbank and the Southland? What role does it play in your story?
I don't really look at Disney in this book, but I think that Disney has done an excellent job of reinforcing the idea of the European fairy tale world as an entirely white world. In this book, I open by asking people to imagine themselves in a fairy tale world, to look around and notice what they see, the different, landscapes, the castles, the forest, the magical creatures. And I kind of ask, do you see anybody who's not white? And I think a lot of times when I've spoken with people about this book and that opening, many of their images of that fairy tale world come from Disney's animated features, which began with Snow White in the 1930s, I believe, the late 1930s. So I think Disney's been critical in really establishing and maintaining that fairy tale world as a white world.
Well, Kimberly Lau, author of the book Specters of the Marvelous, Race and the Development of the European Fairy Tale, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thanks again for having me. It was really lovely to speak with you.
Ditto.
818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. Freedom Now, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom from the press. What does that mean? The right for media, newspapers, online news to report information without government censorship. First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Freedom of speech, the right to voice opinions and ideas through words, symbols, or actions. Freedom of religion, the right to believe or not believe in a religion and to practice it freely. Freedom Now, freedom of assembly, the right to gather peacefully in groups. We have a right to do that. That's what freedom's all about. And that's why it's important that Freedom Now stays on the air. Freedom to petition, the right to ask the government to fix problems or make changes. So my people, I'm talking to you. We're fighting the big fight. How about you? You think you can support us in an easy way by pledging your support of $25, $50 for all the volunteers here that keep it going? That money would not go to the volunteers as much as we like to give it to them. It goes to keep the antenna transmitter working properly. A giant transmitter on Mount Wilson from a little radio station that has big topics and big opinions and big facts. 818-985-5735. We are offering Michelle Alexander the new Jim Crow book, and this is for a $100 donation. Talking about Jim Crow today. Jim Crow is actually happening today, right now. You probably don't even know about it. So if you take time to go to your phone, pledge your support, you not only get the book, but you get the companion talk, recorded in the Bay Area by Michelle Alexander. If you haven't heard it, it is ear-opening. And it tells you the truth about the facts of people of color, especially men, in the prison system and how they got there. I think one of the biggest things in life for a person of color, such as myself and maybe you or someone you know, is that you want to stay out the justice system. It's so easy to get caught up through a traffic ticket, turns into a warrant, they take your license, they jail you, because you can't afford it. You can't afford the ticket. 818-985-5735. The 5 freedoms are internationally accepted standards of care that affirm every living being's right to humane treatment. Freedom Now, freedom of speech and expression, peaceful assembly or association. 818-985-5735. Please call. We're down to the wire. We only have a few pledges. We're not even halfway to our goal, which is $1,000. Time is running out, and we are short a little bit over $500. Can you help us? That $100 goes a long way. Freedom Now, freedom of speech. Freedom is a right. Freedom gives citizens basic freedom with respect to speech and expression. It's important to understand the scope of these provisions and any exceptions thereof. 818-985-5735. We are getting one pledge that's coming in. I just want to let you know about this Blues and Jazz Queens collection. You get, for a $160 donation called a phone room, Ella Fitzgerald Icon 2 CD set, Essential Nina Simone 2 CD set, Ken Burns Billie Holiday CD, and Etta James Best of CD for a $160 donation. That's a part of your Black History Month and KPFK's thank you gift to you for pledging online at kpfk.org or calling 818-985-5735.
For KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Jason Borge, Professor of Latin American and Cultural Studies at the University of Texas at Austin, and author of the book Jazz Odyssey, The Global Lives of Booker T. Pittman. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Jason Borge.
Pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. So who was Booker T. Pittman, and why did you decide to write a book about him?
Yeah, so Booker T. Pittman was he was, in the first place, the grandson of Booker T. Washington. But he was also a very important figure, if not the most important figure of jazz in South America for probably 30 years, between the 30s and the 60s. And there just hadn't been much written about him. I had published a previous book on jazz with Duke University Press called Tropical Riffs, which for that research, I bumped into Booker's name a lot. And part of the reason I started writing this subsequent book was because I felt like I hadn't really, he hadn't figured prominently enough in my last book, and that he really needed more scholarly attention, that he was a really, really important, vital figure who also had a very interesting, colorful life. So I just found that I found him as a figure really fascinating, and the deeper I got into it, I became more fascinated. I also came in contact, I guess this was in around 2018, just before the pandemic. I met his stepdaughter, Eliana Pittman, who is a celebrity in Brazil. She particularly was famous in the 1970s and 80s, 60s, 70s, and 80s in Brazil. And she also really encouraged me to write this book and to make it a book as opposed to just an article or two. And she was very convincing. And she also availed me to a lot of materials that she had. Her stepfather was not just her stepfather for her, he was also her mentor as an artist. And so for this, for a series of reasons, I felt that I could identify with certain parts of his story somehow. These are the sort of intangibles that go into choosing a subject for a biography, right? So I just, for all those reasons, thought, okay, this is worth it. Let me take the deep dive and write this book. Otherwise, I felt nobody else was going to.
So what were his instruments, and who did critics compare him to, for example, on his instruments?
Yeah, great question. He was a multi-instrumentalist. However, he was probably, depending on when you're talking about, early on, he started off as a clarinetist, actually, when he first started playing in the 1920s. He was born in 1909, and so the first instrument he learned was the clarinet. His mother, by the way, who was Booker T. Washington's daughter, was a trained musician, very prominent teacher in Dallas, Texas. And so, though she would have been actually encouraging her son to go into classical music and that whole tradition. And he really just said, no, I want to do the jazz. This is really when jazz was taking off historically. And so she, but she was, I would say, a formative influence on him at the time. So he began learning the clarinet, and then by the 1930s, he had kind of transitioned into the alto saxophone, and that is really what made him, if not famous, at least well known in certain circles in Kansas City and then New York in the late 20s and 1930s. And it was becoming clear that he was really a virtuoso performer at the time. And so, and then later in his career, he did sing sometimes. He sang on a few recordings. He also, later in his career, he embraced the soprano saxophone. And that would have been in the 1950s, so that was a little bit later. But I would say probably the main instrument would have still been the alto saxophone. And he was compared to, in the 1930s, he was compared to some of the top alto sax players of the day. He was Benny Carter, Johnny Hodges, and he was spoken in the same breath at one time, at least before he left, right before he left Paris. He was really sort of considered one of the real hot shots on his instrument. And then when he traveled to Rio, it kind of set into motion a whole series of circumstances that changed that, and I can explain that a little bit later.
Now, Booker T. Washington passed away when Booker T. Pittman was a young child.
Yeah,
but still, were you able to detect any influence of the grandfather on the grandson?
Yeah, well, yes, I was. It took me a long time to sort of really, for that to make itself evident. But what I realized was that Booker T. Pittman was, I'm going to give you a little bit of a long answer to this, that Booker T. Pittman he was running away a lot. There was a lot of, escape was it was a really big thing in his life. And part of what he was running away from was his very strict upbringing. So he had a father who was really one of Booker T. Washington's, he was an architect in Dallas, and one of Booker T. Washington's real proteges. However, he was very strict, his father. And so I think that kind of strict upbringing stayed with him. And at first he rebelled against it. And then later in his life, he sort of came to an understanding of what his grandfather meant, what his message was. And he kind of accepted his legacy a little more later, although he never really made peace with his own father, who was violent and an alcoholic and separated from his mother shortly after Booker Pittman left Dallas, Texas, for Kansas City. So it was a sort of there was a lot of drama in his upbringing, which was an unusual one in a lot of ways. Grew up in a middle-class home, had a lot of, for a black man in the 1920s, had a lot of privileges, but also a lot of pressures that came from being Booker T. Washington's grandson. He literally went to high school at a high school in Dallas called Booker T. Washington High School. So you can imagine how that must have affected him and his siblings.
So he engaged in self-exile in Paris and, of course, Rio de Janeiro and Brazil. You mentioned a moment or two ago that you were going to expand upon the impact of Brazil upon his life trajectory.
Yeah.
But before you get into that, did he speak French and or Portuguese?
Yes. I don't know if languages were his forte. I heard a couple of interviews from him later in his life, and he mixed he mixed them a lot because he ended up learning some French. I think he forgot most of his French later in life, but then he learned Portuguese, and then he learned Spanish. And so by the time he was in his 50s, he was sort of mixing a lot of Spanish and Portuguese together. But he did, he married. He ended up marrying a Brazilian woman in the 1950s. His earlier relationships are a little foggy. I wasn't able to kind of get a lot of good facts, but he married apparently either a Uruguayan or a Brazilian woman prior to that, in one of his sort of self-exiles or what I call infra-exiles within South America. But his real sort of solid and lasting marriage was with Ophelia Pittman, who was Eliana's mother.
So he disappeared from time to time, apparently because of, or at least related to, substance abuse, drug and alcohol abuse.
Yeah.
I take it that was mostly in Brazil. Is that a fair estimate?
Actually, it began in earnest. So when he traveled over from just to kind of stick to a basic timetable here. He was in Kansas City around 28 to 30, and then in New York for a couple of years, and then he spent between 1933 and 35 in Paris. And so when he left Paris in 1935, he actually went because he made some connections in Paris, and he got a year-long contract with a casino that was opening in Rio de Janeiro. That was the draw. But it seems that although he had some, he was starting to drink a little bit in New York for sure, probably even Kansas City, and in Rio, he really started to get into the heavy drugs when he moved to Buenos Aires, actually. So this would have been in 1936. So late 30s, early 40s, when he was in Buenos Aires in Uruguay. And it turns out there were a lot of accessible, drugs, a lot of cocaine and heroin and so forth in Buenos Aires at the time, which was a big jazz town at the same time. But that's where it started to get really complicated with him. And then to get off of the heavy drugs, he went to drinking, and then that led to an exile in the hinterlands of Uruguay for a couple of years. And then a few years later, in the 1950s, into the state of Paraná in Brazil, which is kind of off the beaten track, which was on purpose, right? He was really trying to get away from vice, influences. And this was he did this twice, right, in a really major way. And he ended up staying in this sort of exile within an exile, infra-exile in Brazil for a few years, until he was discovered by a apparently painting a brothel. This was probably the most, there are a lot of different theories about what happened, but this French perfume salesman who was selling perfume in different areas happened to be a jazz fan and remembered Booker from his Paris days. And so he said, hey, and the first thing he did when he saw the Booker T. Washington is he showed him a magazine, a headline saying that he was dead. He had died. And so this set a chain of events. Suddenly he was sort of rediscovered, and then he went back to Sao Paulo and then to Rio, and his whole career began again. And it's a little bit like a Buena Vista Social Club ending, where he really gained a lot of celebrity and renown and sobriety. in Sao Paulo and then Rio de Janeiro at the end of his life.
Did he physically resemble Booker T. Washington?
He did a little bit. He wasn't. He was a very sort of thinner build, a little lighter skinned, and so not a whole lot, but I think he started to identify with something in his grandfather's upbringing, and there was a pride there, right? That you could sort of, in his memoirs, came to the surface which he was writing at the end of his life.
Hmm.
So yeah.
Did he express any favoritism towards Brazil over Buenos Aires, over Montevideo, or was all sort of the same?
Well, I think early on, he was just so intent on playing where he wanted to play the way he wanted to play. In the 1930s, big bands were the thing, right? And he wasn't really a big band fan. He wasn't really into that. He liked the smaller format ensembles in the 1930s, and so he this is one of the reasons that Paris appealed to him, because there's a lot of small formatted jazz being played in the mid 1930s in Paris. But he got to he loved Brazil immediately. So it was really love at first sight. When he ended up coming back to Brazil in the very early 1950s, he says in his memoirs, and then in some later interviews, it was really like, this is where I belong. So he had really a sense of connection and belonging to Brazil, specifically to Rio. He just really loved it, and that's toward the end of the book. That's what I try to emphasize. This was really felt like his home more than anything else, although he did return to the United States twice in the 1960s after he had become famous again, thanks in large part to his playing on the Jack Paar program. It was like a big deal back then, right? Jack Paar was one of the leading late night hosts, and he had been on vacation, and he discovered Booker playing with Eliana at this point, who was still a teen, but Booker and his stepdaughter started playing together, and they were invited to go to the United States, and so they ended up spending. They actually went there twice, once in 62 for a short stint, and then they went back in 64 for a year, and they were playing in clubs in Manhattan and everything else. So it was a really interesting time. But he when he got back to Brazil, he said, "This is where I want to stay." And it was really a dearer home to him by that point, at least. He just felt more comfortable there and loved the culture. And it was a time in the 1960s of a lot of sort of chaos in the United States, including racial chaos, and he didn't like everything that he saw when he went back to the States. And so he got back to Brazil and just said, this is a better life for me.
He didn't like everything that he saw. Could you elaborate upon that point?
Yeah, I mean, he doesn't talk a lot about racial prejudice in his memoirs, but he does. I was able to kind of I did a lot of archival research and newspaper coverage in Brazil from that era, and it just seemed that he didn't feel that it had quite changed enough in the United States for him, right? Even though maybe he had expectations that it would be better by 1964, the year of civil rights legislation, but he really just felt on an affective level, right, an emotional level. He just felt more at home in Brazil. There was a sort of an acceptance of Booker as a black man, although he did encounter problems in Brazil too. I don't want to make this sound like Brazil is this it's this special place where there's no racial strife or clashes. But he did find that overall it was a place where he was treated a little better.
Mm-hmm. Finally, Jason Borge, author of the book Jazz Odyssey, The Global Lives of Booker T. Pittman. What about the paternal side of his family, the Pittmans? You mentioned that his father was an architect who had certain problems. Anything else to add about that side of the family?
Yeah, I didn't really go into that too much. I focused on his father, but I didn't go back to his father's ancestors. His father, though, was a really, he had sort of mixed race ancestry, and so he was, and he was just a very difficult person, right? So he was a lot of the people he was when he was in Dallas. He fought with the black community more than anything else, right? He was sort of his rivalries and he opened a newspaper after he stopped practicing architecture. He opened this basically like a newspaper so that he could rant against everything that bothered him in Dallas. And so he was just a lot of conflict in his life. And, he was also, he was this protege. I mean, he really was a protege of Booker T. Washington. It's like one of his favorite students and brilliant, right? But he obviously got kind of wrapped up in his own alcoholism and encountered, Dallas at the time was not an easy place to live. For a black family, even one of means at the time. So he was just he had a lot of difficulties. And then his wife and Booker T. Washington's daughter ended up just leaving him. He had beaten their daughter at a certain point, and it was just sort of a last straw thing, and she just left.
Mm-hmm.
And she went. She actually went to Alabama. She went and ended up teaching at the institution that Booker T. Washington had begun. So she kind of went back, and that's how she ended her life. Just ended up going back there and teaching and living her own life.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
My pleasure.
And in closing, we'd like to thank our guests and thank you to everybody who donated this hour. You can still donate by calling 818-985-5735 or online at kpfk.org. Stay tuned for our brother Dino with The Signal coming up next. Signing off for Freedom Now, this is Sister Thage, and until next week, as always, we stand ready for revolution.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.
Power to the people.